So I decided to record a video today. I've got some notes, but I want to freestyle this, maybe just have something to reference. This is a video about how I became a restaurant owner at 25. We're going to go into some details and let's get into it. So to start, I was incredibly fortunate to be born in the USA. There is no better place for opportunity, and I won the lottery from the get-go. That's not to say that people in other places in the world can't make things happen, especially in the modern age with the internet and online business, but this gave me a massive head start. Moving along to some of the more specific things that I went through, I have and had incredible grandparents and parents. My grandparents were Baptist missionaries, and they felt a calling from God and dedicated most of their lives to teaching Christian ethics in Colombia, teaching English. They're both fluent in Spanish as well. And the impact that each of them had on me growing up absolutely plays into the person I became and the things that I'm involved in professionally and spiritually. Growing up, seeing how powerful speaking a foreign language was had a massive impact on me. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I'd consider myself, I'm able to read and write fairly well. And that's the foundation for learning any language, learning the sounds of the letters and the grammar. But seeing my grandparents and even my parents, my uncles, my aunts, how powerful being fluent is in Spanish, it really opens up a lot of opportunities in life. And I'll dig into that a little bit later in my own personal experience. But yeah, so my grandparents, they sacrificed pretty much everything, and I grew up seeing that. My grandmother taught home economics, and my grandfather taught, like I said, Christian ethics and English at the seminary in Colombia. From a very young age, my grandmother really took me under her wing and taught me about gardening and cooking and the value of clean water and food. And my grandfather, who holds a PhD, but he's not one to really talk about that or speak on that. He always carried himself very professionally and was always staying busy, but had a good balance with family and communal responsibilities. And my parents, while we're all flawed people, my parents sacrificed so much for the upbringing that I had. And in a very similar way, they were working hard on their own businesses. They worked for companies as well. But every day they were pushing themselves to do better, to learn more, to earn more, to pass on to my brother and I growing up. And seeing those things, my grandparents, my parents, seeing how they moved, how they worked, that was the massive impact on me. It's something I still strive for to this day, something that I looked up to. We're outside in the backyard. It's summertime in Florida, and we got a lot of bugs and some thunderstorms about to crack the sky open, but hopefully we'll stay dry. Just to turn into a larger point, when it came to the restaurant work, sticking to something, that being restaurant work, was one of the most important aspects of how I became an owner at 25 years old. I got my first restaurant job when I was 15 years old. I was a dishwasher at a local diner, dishwasher busboy. And I didn't necessarily enjoy the work, but I remember coming home to my dad one night and telling him, how hot it was and how, my hands were blistering and breaking from the soap. And I was like, maybe I want to try some different work. And he laughed at me and he said, it doesn't matter what you do. The important thing is that you stick with it until one day you'll appreciate the fact that you're great at it. So he told me no matter what line of work you're in, no matter what you're doing, there's going to be a silver lining of, BS to deal with. So that really stuck with me from, like I said, about 15 years old. My second job was at a popular national smoothie chain. Maybe you know what that is. And I got that opportunity from a close friend in the neighborhood at 16. And I learned a lot at that job. They had just opened that restaurant when I started working there. So I learned a lot about, what it took to get the restaurant off the ground. And I worked there for 3.5 years, all through high school. And even as 17, 18 years old, being asked to check inventory for orders, I messed it up, obviously, and they didn't let me do it again. But being asked to do those kinds of things at such a young age, it really made me feel proud of, okay, I must be onto something here in this industry if they're willing to ask me to do stuff like this. And when I eventually went on to early college, I transferred to the same restaurant at a different franchise and continued working there. But I started to have urges to spread my wings and learn some new skills. And I eventually found a bar back job at a fancy Italian restaurant in Southeast Florida, in Boca Raton. And as a bar back, I was responsible for stocking the bars, dishwashing, doing inventory for liquor and beer and wine, changing kegs. I remember we had 3 tiers of kegs, like full barrel kegs. And I'd have to, lift it to the first level, climb to the second level, lift it to the second level. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself and about, what really goes into a successful restaurant with a full bar, full kitchen. I remember they had liquid nitrogen as well. They'd make liquor slushies with liquid nitrogen. So that was one of my responsibilities as well, was refilling the liquid nitrogen dispensers. And that was a very cool experience. And while I was there, I was 19, 20 years old. And I had aspirations to bartend, but I was still very shy in these days. And the bar managers and upper management weren't comfortable with me behind the bar. This was, a pretty uppity, fancy restaurant in a pretty wealthy area in Boca Raton, and they just felt I couldn't connect to the guests, and fair enough. So I eventually transferred to a new school in North Florida, and I found a job at a little mom and pop diner up there, and I worked behind the counter for probably a month or two before they saw, like, okay, this guy can handle a lot more, because the work was very similar to the years I had put in doing, wraps and sandwiches and drinks. So they gave me a chance to be a waiter, and I was still a very shy kid at this time, but I really appreciate that opportunity becoming a waiter because it forced me out of my shell. I really had to develop the personality and become more whimsical in my speech. And there's a small sales aspect. Sales, I wouldn't consider restaurant work true sales because people are coming in hungry. But being able to guide somebody through the menu and through the products that we have to offer, there's absolutely a sales aspect in that regard. And I consider sales an information exchange at the end of the day. But I waited tables at that restaurant for about 2-3 years. And during the time I worked there, they had become a local staple, had gotten very, very busy over those 2-3 years I worked there. And I had gone from, walking home with $40-50 in tips to some days, if there was a big sporting event, I'd walk home with, $200, sometimes even $300 in tips. And, I earned that. I busted, I don't want to swear, but I kicked myself in the butt at that job and learned a lot. Probably did $1 million in revenue in the few years I was there. And the owners there were very grateful of me. One little side note while I was working there, a local entrepreneur in the community came in to eat. I didn't know who they were when I waited on them, but I was doing my thing. And at the end of the meal, she let me know, said, hey, I have some restaurants in town. Our servers make a lot of money. If your schedule ever changes or something happens, please come apply. And that kind of stuck in the back of my head. She incepted this idea. And soon enough, my school schedule changed. I could no longer work the mornings at this mom and pop breakfast diner. So I went out and applied to work at this restaurant she had mentioned. It was probably a couple of years later than when she first told me that, when I waited on her. And I went and applied at this restaurant. I remember I had my resume. It was like a fine, thick linen paper. It was purple paper, and I sprayed cologne on it. It was my first time ever applying for a job like that. I had always kind of been, ushered in by friends or some kind of connection. So I really went all out with my resume. And they took one look at that resume and were kind of like, all right, we got to give this guy a shot. Like, I've never seen anything like this. They hired me, and I was working probably almost full time there, but I was open to do anything. I was like, hey, I can work behind the bar, I can wait tables, I can run food, I can scrub the corners, I can discombobulate the doohickeys, I can, brush the ceiling tiles, whatever you need. And I was working there for about 2 or 3 months and was getting some traction, started getting more bartending shifts, waiting tables more often. And the owners and management there started to kind of see that, I held myself to a higher standard. I stood out from the status quo. I always kept myself busy. Like I said, I would be on my hands and knees scrubbing, the dirtiest, nastiest corners of the spot that nobody ever wanted to clean, let alone management wouldn't even ask people to clean just because they maybe felt bad. And we also had just started third-party delivery around those times. And I remember I was working at the food running station, and we had gotten really busy, a lot of third-party delivery tickets. And we kept having issues with tickets getting misplaced and mistakes happening. So I'd said to the owner, I didn't know he was the owner, but I saw someone walking through just in regular attire. And he seemed like somebody who was higher up I had seen here and there. And I said, we should get a little ticket rail so we can keep our tickets organized. Something very simple that I had used at other restaurants. We're getting some rain now, but it's not too bad. And that was our first conversation, who eventually became my business partner at the first restaurant I opened. And so he started having conversations with me about the third-party delivery, what was the commission rates. He saw that I was interested in the inner workings of the food business. And a little later on, maybe a month or so later, now we're gonna move inside, it's starting to pour. So not an ideal background, but we're making it work. So a month or two later, it was a slower lunch service. I was by myself doing the food expo, running food. And we were close to lunch break. There's only one cook on the line in the kitchen as well. And he put out a dish in the pass for me to grab and run to the table. And I noticed that it wasn't prepared properly. It was a seared salmon in a miso sauce. And he forgot to saute the vegetables in the sauce to get them tender and cooked. And I mentioned to him, I said, hey, the vegetables are missing. And thinking, he'd redo it the right way. He took the plate back and just sprinkled raw vegetables like zucchini, like some vegetables you don't eat raw. He just sprinkled them on top of the plate and pushed it back through the pass. And he's like, oh, it's fine like that. They won't care. And that bothered me. I can't really say for any specific reason. I mean, obviously, it's not the standard. I'm there by myself. So I felt it was my responsibility to say something and hold him accountable to, so people are paying good money for this food. So I said to him, I said, hey, we can't serve it like that. It's not the recipe. It's not the standard. And he started to argue with me. And I told him, if you don't want to do it right, I'll jump back there and I'll do it right. I'll figure it out. And he stormed off into the fridge, had a little tantrum. I went back into the line and started figuring out, I'd never cooked there before, started to try and figure out how to prepare this dish. And about 30 seconds later, he came back and he apologized. And he's like, you're absolutely right. I'll get it right for you. And word about that interaction started to spread around the restaurant. And one of the assistant managers there, soon after that, asked me to be his assistant manager at a new restaurant he was opening down the street. And I was like, hell yeah. It was an opportunity to spread my wings even further. I'd never been in a management role before. And it sounded like a good opportunity. So moving on to starting to work over there, maybe like 2 or 3 months later, I started as his manager. And I had zero clue what I was doing. It was, again, I don't want to swear, but it was kind of a shit show. not anyone's fault in particular. The building was dilapidated, and there was a lot of chaos with staffing. A lot of people dropped out of this opportunity at the last moment. And it was also kind of an odd location in an odd part of town. And I don't want to go too deep into that story. I can talk more about any of these points I made in the video if you guys want to leave a comment. But that restaurant didn't work out. I worked there maybe 3 months, 4 months, and the owners decided it wasn't worth continuing the investment. And I was pretty lost at that time in my life. I was considering going back home. And one of the business partners of this new restaurant, the same one who I spoke with about putting the rails in and was talking to about the third-party delivery business, he told me he had another opportunity. And he told me to come meet with him the next day for lunch. So I show up for lunch the next day, and he's there with all the big partners at the restaurant I had been working at just previously. They were all the investors at this restaurant who failed. They told me they had a new opportunity right by the local university for another Asian restaurant. And they told me that I wasn't their first choice, I wasn't their second choice, but their first two choices didn't want it. They dropped out of the opportunity. So I took the leap of faith. I said, yeah, sign me up. I'm down, let's do it. And this was in 2018. So I was freshly 25. I think I was 24 actually. I was 24 when we first opened. My birthday is in the summer. We opened in late spring. So I was now managing a new restaurant. It was at a killer location, S-tier location, great location. And it was a turnkey space. So basically in commercial real estate, it was a restaurant that had already been built. It was only a year old. So all the infrastructure was brand new. And the previous tenants had, I guess, the business failed. They stopped paying their rent. So the local management company reached out to, I guess, different Asian restaurants in town and offered the opportunity up. I'm sure there's something deeper than that about how they got wind of the opportunity. But anywho, I was the general manager of this restaurant. And I made a deal with the owners. After a year, if we're starting to turn a monthly profit, they'll give me a chance to buy some equity in the business. And that's pretty much how it all happened. I learned a lot along the way. I had great mentors who took me under their wing. And when I was 25 years old in 2019, I was given an opportunity to invest into the equity of the business. And now we're 7 years in, the business is booming. And I'm eager for the next opportunity. So just to review what I discussed, being born in the States, you have every opportunity to make something happen for yourself. Think about the people in your lives, whether it's your family, your mentors, and how they move, how professional they are, and try to emulate some of the characteristics that you see in them. Sticking to something. It's better to roll with the punches and learn an industry and stick with it than always bouncing to something new and just rolling with the same punches over and over again, never really getting above the entry level stresses. Finally, find a way to get noticed by the higher ups. Do things that others aren't willing to do. Think about how you can provide more value to the business as a whole, or just the people as a whole, and they might consider you when an opportunity comes up. Overcoming failure, like I mentioned, that restaurant where I had my first opportunity to be a manager went under, and I could have easily pouted and decided, the past 8 years of restaurant work were for nothing. I failed when I tried to move up in the ladder. I overcame that failure, and finally I had that opportunity that stuck. And like I said, the restaurant's been open 7 years now, and we're doing very well. If there's any aspect of this video you want me to go into a little more depth about, please leave a comment. If you have any questions, leave a comment, like, subscribe, and until next time.